In this video, we are going to cover some basic terminology from Chapter 6. Normal resting heart rate is defined as 60 to 100 beats per minute, and it's most accurate upon waking up in the morning before you've had any environmental effects on your heart rate, things like heat, altitude, smoking, caffeine, stress, physical activity, etc. The lowest resting heart rate ever measured, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, was 27 beats per minute. Generally, we see very low resting heart rates regularly in the 30s and 40s in highly trained endurance athletes, and we'll talk about that later and what the connection is there. Bradycardia is a term that basically describes a heart rate of under 60 beats per minute. Okay, it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you if you have bradycardia. It's just a descriptive term for a heart rate under 60. And tachycardia is defined as a heart rate of 100 beats, of greater than 100 beats per minute. So again, doesn't mean there's something wrong. It's just a descriptive term. So when you exercise, you regularly go into a rhythm that's called tachycardia. All right, so one complete contraction of the heart is called a cardiac cycle or a heartbeat. So when we say that your heart beats 60 times a minute, we're also saying that you have 60 cardiac cycles per minute. So let's look at the heart again. Okay, so you've got your right atria, right ventricle, left atria, left ventricle. And the heart actually pumps in a two-step pumping action. So what happens is the two atria on the top contract. Then there's about a 0.1 second delay, and then the ventricles contract. Okay, so it's a two-step. The word diastole is used when one of the heart chambers is at rest, and the term systole is used when a heart chamber is contracting. Okay. So again, two-step pumping action, contract, then while these are relaxing, there's a 0.1 second pause, and these contract. And then these relax, and the whole thing starts again. So one set of contraction, atria, then ventricle, that equals one heartbeat, one cardiac cycle. All right, let me draw my heart again. All right, so the cardiac cycle has two phases, a contraction and a relaxation. And when we talk about the cardiac cycle and we just use the term diastole, what we're referring to is what's going on with the ventricle. Okay? But keep in mind that the atria also has two phases. Okay? So the ventricle are going to relax. We call that ventricular diastole. And then the ventricles are going to contract. We call that ventricular systole. But simultaneously, there's something going on with the right atria. Okay? So during ventricular relaxation, so when the chambers here on the bottom of the heart are relaxed, they're filling. Okay? And most of a cardiac cycle at rest, about 2/3 of the cardiac cycle at rest, is spent while the ventricles are resting. Now, while the ventricles are resting, simultaneously, the atria are contracting. Okay? So what we've got here is these chambers are at rest, and they're filling because these chambers are contracting. Okay? Because when the chambers contract, what they're doing is squeezing blood. So when the right atria contracts, it's squeezing blood into the right ventricle. When the left atria contract, it's squeezing blood into the left ventricle. So when the atria are contracting, they're squeezing blood and the ventricles are filling. Okay? So during ventricular relaxation, they are filling because the atria are contracting, pushing that blood into the ventricles. Once the ventricles are full, we go to the next stage of the cardiac cycle, which is ventricular ejection, okay, ventricular systole. So this is when the ventricles are contracting, and when they're contracting, they are ejecting blood. And remember that when the left ventricle ejects blood, it ejects its blood into the aorta, and when the right ventricle ejects its blood, it ejects its blood into the pulmonary system. Okay? So during ventricular contraction, the ventricles are contracting and squeezing. Now the left ventricle is emptying. It's ejecting blood, which is going into the aorta. The right ventricle is squeezing blood and ejecting blood, which is going into the pulmonary system. So we call this ventricular ejection. So 2/3 of the cycle is with for 2/3 of a cardiac cycle at rest, the ventricles are relaxed, and for the other third, they're contracting. And then simultaneously, while the ventricles are contracting, now the atria are in diastole. The atria are relaxed. Okay, the atria are refilling, filling up, getting ready again to eject more blood into the ventricles. So the right atria is being filled by the vena cava, and the left atria is being filled by the blood coming back from the pulmonary system. Okay, so 2 phases of the cardiac cycle. We usually talk about the phases in relationship to what's going on with the ventricle, but keep in mind what's also happening to the atria at the same time. Okay, so if we just said diastole, the default would be ventricular diastole. Okay, if you wanted to refer to atrial diastole, you would need to say atrial diastole. Okay, and you're going to see that with a lot of the terminology that we cover, is that the default terminology is related to the ventricles, in particular the left ventricle. All right, so some more terminology. We've already talked about heart rate, but we'll mention it again. So heart rate is just the number of times the left ventricle contracts per minute. Okay? And again, like I said, when we are just talking about the default terms, we're usually talking about the ventricle, usually the left ventricle. Okay, so keep in mind that all 4 chambers are contracting at a rate, okay, which is usually the same as the left ventricular rate. If it's not, then you're going to have some problems with your heart. But by definition, heart rate is the number of times that the left ventricle contracts per minute. Okay, we'll talk about the effector and the exercise effects during class. Right now, what I just want to do is focus on terminology. And so the units for heart rate is beats per minute, which is abbreviated BPM. Stroke volume is the volume of blood ejected from the left ventricular with the left ventricle with each contraction. Okay, so when the left ventricle contracts, it ejects a volume of blood. Okay, and we call that stroke volume. So every time the left ventricle contracts, it squeezes. Okay, when it squeezes, a volume of blood comes out, and that volume is called stroke volume, okay? And the units for stroke volume are milliliters per beat. Sometimes we just say milliliters and the per beat is assumed because you know that stroke volume is a volume per beat. So it could be either milliliters per beat or just milliliters. The next term is cardiac output, which is often abbreviated Q. Sometimes you will see it abbreviated CO, and that's a problem because CO is also an abbreviation, the same abbreviation as carbon monoxide. So I prefer to use the abbreviation Q. And cardiac output definition is the volume of blood ejected from left ventricle per minute. Okay, so what we have here is the number of contractions per minute, the volume that comes out with each contraction, and then cardiac output is the volume that comes out per minute. Okay, so cardiac output, the formula for cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. That. All right, so if you have a heart rate you have a heart rate of 70 beats per minute, okay, and that's the heart rate. And you have a stroke volume, and these are fairly normal resting values. If you have a stroke volume of 70 milliliters per beat, okay, that's stroke volume, and you multiply them, you see that the beats cancel, and you're left with 4,900 milliliters per minute. Okay, and that'll be your cardiac output. However, cardiac output is usually expressed in liters per minute, not milliliters per minute. So you need to take 4,900 milliliters per minute and convert it into liters. Okay, and 1 liter is 1,000 milliliters. So if you do the math, 4,900 divided by 1,000 milliliters cancel, 4.9 liters per minute. Okay, so all we did was we took the decimal place and we moved it 3 spots to the left. Okay, so if I gave you a heart rate of 70, a stroke volume of 70, and asked you to calculate cardiac output, you should come up with 4.9. Okay? All right, more terminology. End diastolic volume, and we are talking about the end diastolic volume of the left ventricle. Okay, again, most of this terminology is referring to what's going on with the left ventricle. So think about what's happening during diastole. Okay, go back to the definition of diastole. During diastole, the chamber is at rest, and we're talking about the left ventricle. And when the left ventricle is at rest, it's filling with blood. Okay? And so end diastolic volume is the volume of blood in the left ventricle at the end of filling. Okay? Or at the end of diastole. So during diastole, left ventricle is filling with blood, and at the end of diastole, there's a volume of blood in the left ventricle that we call end diastolic volume. Okay, that's going to be the greatest amount of blood in the left ventricle because it's completely filled, and this is the volume right before it contracts. So the same way, let's talk about end systolic volume. So end systolic volume is the volume of blood in the left ventricle. And think about it, what's going on during systole? Okay? During systole, the left ventricle is contracting and it's ejecting blood. Okay? So it's the volume of blood in the left ventricle at the end of contraction. Okay? So when the left ventricle contracts, certain volume of blood leaves, okay, and you're going to be left with some blood. Okay, so when the left ventricle contracts, it does not eject all of its blood. Okay, the blood left in the left ventricle at the end of contraction is called end systolic volume. Okay, so it's going to be a lower amount. And the amount that was actually ejected, okay, you know what that is. The amount that was actually ejected is the stroke volume. Okay. So you can easily calculate one of these three factors if you knew the other two. Okay. So stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. Okay. So here's your end diastolic volume. You subtract the end systolic volume, and you're left with stroke volume. Okay, I'll show you another picture of that on another slide. One other term is ejection fraction. And ejection fraction is just what percentage of end diastolic volume was ejected. Okay. And ejection fraction is calculated as stroke volume divided by end diastolic volume times 100. So if you're not familiar with calculating percentages, you might want to look into that and practice that. Go to the Khan Academy, get some information on percentages because we will be using some percentages in this class. So we want to know what percent was ejected. Okay, so what we started with was EDV, and what we ejected was stroke volume. And so if we want to know what percentage was ejected, you take the amount ejected divided by the amount that we started with, and you multiply it by 100. And on the next slide, we'll have an example of that. Draw something here. All right, so let's say you've got EDV. Okay, the left ventricle is full. Your EDV, let's just say that this is 100 milliliters. Okay. Now the left ventricle contracts. It ejects some blood into the aorta. Okay. That volume that it just injected into the aorta is called stroke volume. Okay, so let's say that got ejected. Okay. And now what you're left with is end systolic volume. Okay? So you can see here that the whole thing is EDV. Okay? And if you want to calculate EDV, you could add stroke volume to ESV, and you're going to get EDV. Okay, remember that stroke volume is EDV minus ESV. So you could play with that formula in a lot of different ways. If you want to know ejection fraction, okay, you want to know what percentage got ejected. And if you're familiar with percentages, what you need to do is you need to take you want to know that what percentage of stroke volume, what percentage of stroke volume is from EDV. Okay, so it would be stroke volume over EDV. And this is going to tell you what percentage was ejected. Okay, because this is the volume ejected. Okay, and if you want to know how to calculate the percentage, you take that volume ejected, you divide it by the total volume that you originally started with, you multiply it by 100, and you're going to get your ejection fraction. So for the example I gave you, I said that the EDV was 100, the stroke volume was 40. Okay, so we've got 40 over 100 times 100 is 40. Okay, so for this example, the ejection fraction is 40%. As far as numbers, a normal resting ejection fraction is about 60%. And as you might expect, it goes up during exercise to approximately 74%. That's going to vary depending on the individual and depending on the intensity of the exercise. Here's another way to look at those same terms. So here we have the ventricle, okay, and we're talking about the left ventricle. And when the ventricle is full, okay, right before it contracts, when it's done filling, we've got the end diastolic volume. When it contracts, it ejects a volume of blood into the aorta. That's your stroke volume. And what you're left with in the ventricle is ESV, okay, the amount left at the end of systole. And so to calculate ejection fraction, you take stroke volume, which was 60, and you divide it by EDV, which was 100, and you multiply it by 100, and you have an ejection fraction here of 60%. These are fairly normal, average resting levels. Here also they showed you how to calculate cardiac output. So in this example, you've got a heart rate of 70 beats per minute, you've got a stroke volume of 60 milliliters per beat. You multiply that, you're going to get cardiac output of 4,200 milliliters per minute, and then you need to convert it into liters per minute, and so we have a cardiac output of 4.2 liters per minute. Okay? So hopefully those pictures will help you understand EDV, ESV, SV. I know for myself, the drawing helps me to remember the definitions. All right, so this chapter is the cardiovascular system, and remember that we have three components to the system. We have the pump, which is the heart. We have the vessels, which carry the fluid, and the fluid is blood. So the vessels in the body are varied. There's several different types of vessels. The three primary types of blood vessels are arteries, which are carrying blood away from the heart, capillaries, which carry blood throughout the cells in the body, and the veins which carry blood back to the heart. So let's just say a little bit about each of these types of blood vessels. Arteries are very high pressure. There's a lot of pressure inside of them, and we'll be talking about that and the importance of that. They're very muscular, and they're very elastic. Okay. The aorta is the largest of the arteries. And remember that the aorta is connected to the left ventricle. And so when the left ventricle ejects its blood, the aorta expands and takes that blood in. When the aorta recoils, it drives blood forward through the arterial system. So the arteries, the smaller arteries that branch off of the aorta are called arteries. And arteries branch into even smaller arteries called arterioles. Arterioles are very important. We're going to be talking about arterioles a lot. This is the main site of circulatory control. So these are the vessels that decide, or determine, I should say, where blood goes. Okay, so we're going to see constriction and dilation going on in these arterioles to prioritize where blood goes. So we'll talk a lot about that. The capillaries are very small. They're the smallest vessels in the body. They are only 1 cell thick. Okay, so their membranes are extremely thin. Capillaries is the capillaries are where all exchange occurs. Okay, so when I say exchange between the blood and the tissues or the cells. Okay, because they're only 1 cell thick, it makes it very easy to exchange across the membrane, the capillary membrane. So we've got oxygen crossing over capillaries going into cells, and we've got CO2 crossing out of cells going into capillaries. All different types of things are being exchanged between the blood and the cells. Oxygen, CO2, glucose, FFA, lactic acid, hormones, etc. And then the veins, these are the vessels that are taking blood back to the heart. So when the capillaries are done going through all the cells in the body, and the blood is ready to go back to the heart, it goes back to the heart of the veins, and they start in the smallest veins, which are venules. And those venules branch into larger veins called veins, and the veins branch into the largest veins, which is the vena cava, and there is an inferior vena cava coming from above the heart. That's the superior vena cava coming from above the heart, and we have the inferior vena cava bringing blood back from below the heart. Some things important about veins, they're very low pressure. Okay, so I told you that the arteries are high pressure, the veins are low pressure, and that's going to be important as we talk about blood flow. The veins are also very elastic, and they serve as reservoirs for most of the blood in the body at rest, and you will get to see that on the next slide. The last thing is, so they're elastic. They are also muscular. They're just not as muscular as the arteries. This is just showing you what I said on the last slide, and that is that most of your blood at rest is sitting in your veins. It just gives you numbers about where your blood is. So about 7% is in your heart, 9% in the pulmonary system, 13% in your arteries, 7% in your capillaries. Most of it's in your veins. And I don't think it's important to know these numbers. The most important thing that I want you to get out of this is just that at rest, most of the blood in your body is sitting within the veins. All right, some more terms. We're going to talk about blood pressure. And blood pressure is the pressure exerted by blood on the walls of your blood vessels. But when we go to the doctor and we get our blood pressure taken, they're specifically looking at the pressure exerted by blood on the walls of your arteries. Okay, and we often abbreviate it BP. Okay, and the pressure units that are used to measure blood pressure are millimeters of mercury. There are two phases of blood pressure. So during the cardiac cycle, your blood pressure goes up and down, depending on what's going on in the left ventricle. So remember that you've got your left ventricle that ejects blood into the aorta. Okay? And when the left ventricle is contracting, it ejects a large wave of blood. Okay? And because there's a large wave of blood coming out, there's going to be a lot of pressure exerted on the walls of the aorta. And this wave, this pressure wave, is going to continue on through your arteries. Okay? So the definition of systolic blood pressure is the pressure in the arteries during left ventricular contraction, okay, or during systole. And that's why we call it systolic blood pressure. Okay? It's referring to what's going on, again, with the left ventricle. Systolic pressure is the highest pressure of the cardiac cycle. It doesn't go any higher than that. And a normal systolic blood pressure for an adult is 120 millimeters of mercury. So diastolic pressure, as you might guess, is the pressure in the arteries during left ventricular relaxation, okay, during diastole. When the left ventricles are relaxing, we have diastole, okay? And when the left ventricles are relaxing, there is no blood being ejected, okay? So this wave of blood has moved further down, and right now we don't have any blood coming out of the left ventricle. So when the left ventricle is relaxed, there's no blood being ejected into the aorta, and so the pressure on the walls of the arteries at this point is going to be very low. Okay? And this is the lowest pressure of the cardiac cycle, and for a normal adult, a diastolic blood pressure is 80. Okay? And so what you're going to see over time in your aorta, which will be affecting all the vessels in your body, is you get that wave of blood, and then you get a period of time where there's no blood, and then here comes another wave. Okay? And so you can see here that your pressure is going to go up, it's going to go down, it's going to go up again, it's going to go down. Okay? And this right here is one cardiac cycle. Okay? So in the cardiac cycle, when the left ventricle is contracting, the pressure's up. When the left ventricle is relaxing, the pressure's down, and then we start another cardiac cycle. Hypertension is defined as high pressure, hypertension, high blood pressure, and the cutoff for hypertension is a systolic of 140 or a diastolic of 90. Okay? And you can have systolic hypertension, diastolic hypertension, or you could have high, both values being high. So mean arterial pressure is the average pressure during a cardiac cycle. So remember I told you that during a cardiac cycle at rest, 2/3 of the time is spent in diastole, 1/3 is spent in systole. Okay, so mean arterial pressure, which would be the average pressure throughout one entire cardiac cycle, is not just a simple average of systolic plus diastolic divided by 2. You have to account for the fact that during a cardiac cycle at rest, 2/3 of the time is in diastole, 1/3 is in systole, and so diastole, the pressure during diastole is going to have a greater effect on mean arterial pressure than the pressure during systole. So if you wanted to calculate mean arterial pressure, this is how you would calculate it. Okay. For this class, I'm not going to require you to know this formula. I'm not going to require you to calculate mean arterial pressure. I just want you to understand what it is and that it's not a simple average and that it's affected more by the diastolic pressure than the systolic pressure. Okay? And keep in mind that this is only accurate at rest. Okay? Because at rest, this 1/3, 2/3 relationship exists. Okay? When you start to exercise, this 1/3, 2/3 relationship doesn't exist. Depending on the intensity of the exercise, this relationship is going to change, and there's no way of knowing what that relationship is during exercise, so we cannot calculate mean arterial pressure during exercise.